Welcome fellow spellslingers to the second episode of my new series, where I help you build decks so good that it feels like cheating. You submit decks, and I help make them better, more consistent, and more fun. And in the process, you, dear based viewer, get to watch this and become a master brewer yourself as I teach you all about deck building through the vehicle of deck requests. I hope to leave you with the knowledge to help you perfect your own decks in just the way that you want them. You know, give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish and all of that. So stick around and you'll learn how I think as I apply my 30 years of Magic deck building knowledge to Raffine Scheming Seer and Shiko Paragon of the Way. Raffine was requested by an OG of my community, Kit. So we'll look at Raffine, then review Kit's request, and then I'll walk through my ideas and suggestions on how to improve the deck and look at cards that could be worth considering. Raffine is a 3-mana Esper Sphinx Demon and is a 1/4. They have flying, ward 1, and whenever we attack, one of our attacking creatures connives X, where X is the number of attacking creatures. Now, Raffine is a pretty well-known commander, but surprisingly I've had very little experience with it and never played against it, which makes some of the questions that I ask when I get a review all the more important. I ask these questions to help me diagnose what about a deck can or needs to be improved. Things like, what do you want your deck to do and what is the game plan? Or how does the deck win and with which key cards or types of cards? On what turn does it usually win with no disruption? And what do you like about your deck or what's wrong with it that's making you request this review? And finally, what bracket do you want the deck to be and are there any budget limitations? The process of coming up with clear, concise answers to these questions, even if you're self-diagnosing your own decks, will usually highlight most of the issues with the deck and make it easier to find solutions, either in play patterns or specific cards. Here was Kit's brief for me. This is a mid-range Reanimator beatdown list, and it's themed around cheap 3-mana value Reanimator spells like Helping Hand and Unearth. I'm not looking to change this part of the deck as I don't want to have a generic Reanimator deck. It's partly for this reason that Bracket 2 has felt like a comfortable place for this list to play. The deck feels great when it's online, but it's really hit or miss, and I haven't been able to find the right combination of mill, Reanimator, beatdown, and draw that feels consistent. Sometimes I have games where I have a good mill engine but no payoffs or beaters, and sometimes I have some creatures but no engine and the deck feels like it needs both consistently. The thing that I found the best for this deck is creatures that are both beaters and mill engines, like Nashi Searcher in the Dark or Abhorrent Oculus. Oculus is the best card in the deck by far, and it's what inspired me to make the deck in the first place because of Jeskai Oculus in Standard. I've been considering adding in Tomb effects, but I don't know if that would end up making the deck worse because of the card disadvantage. The deck really struggles with card advantage until it can start recurring those types of engine plus beta cards. I think the main problem I've encountered is that the deck is really bad at card advantage. There is a ton of card selection with all the milling and loot, but I only have around 7 to 9 cards that are actually card positive, and they're pretty conditional. I think the games where I feel like the deck doesn't really get online are the ones where I either run out of cards too fast or don't have some kind of engine. The primary win condition of the deck is through regular combat damage, with the bigger threats like the Goyfs or Ancient One. The deck feels at its best when it's consistently reanimating threats every turn. Okay, that was a really good brief. So let's take a look at the deck list, and I'm going to share my thoughts as I had them when reviewing this. When I call out a specific card, I'm usually calling out a particular play pattern or theme that the card represents in the deck, rather than just a judgment on that particular card in isolation. Firstly, I want to call out that I really like that the deck is going a different direction than traditional Reanimator decks that all feature the same spells and creatures. That does, however, raise a small concern, and that is that the usual strength of a Reanimator deck is to power out a huge game-ending threat before the table is really ready to deal with it. Paying 1 or 2 mana for a creature that normally costs 9 allows for a game-warping explosive burst in power that the deck usually needs to compete. Given the reanimation spells here, like Unearth, are limited by mana value, it completely changes the dynamic of a traditional Reanimator deck. And in this list, the reanimation spells serve a completely different purpose, giving you the opportunity to loot and then discard creatures with less downside because you can use your reanimation spells to get them back and allowing you to build up your graveyard to fuel the synergies in your deck. This is something that I'll look at in more detail when I evaluate the reanimator targets, but as you've said, you want this to be bracket 2, so I'm confident that we can make it work. Now I absolutely love some of the creatures in the deck. Cruel Somnophage, Ancient One, and Abhorrent Oculus are all bangers. I also love how many creatures there are in the deck to fuel the Goyf synergy. The beatdown creatures that we have here are mostly really solid, but I feel like the deck wants more of those aggressive creatures if they exist. This is a mid-range beatdown deck, and in that case I feel like we need more than 1 to 2 real threats by the mid-game. We probably want access to double that or more. so I'll look into what creatures there are to see if we can find any to bolster our game plan. I will however call out Shakedown Heavy, which I really don't like here, because I don't want my opponents to get to choose whether or not they have to deal with one of my threats. Yes, we get a card, but in a mid-range beatdown deck, I don't want my opponent having that choice. As a replacement, I'm going to look into more sources of token creation, like Avenger of the Fallen that we already have, because of the Connive triggers on Raffine. I think that is an area that can do a whole lot of work in this deck. Lastly on creatures, I feel like we want our small creatures to both be impactful and to have evasion, given they are our Connive engine. I don't love Eye Collector and Fairy Dream Thief, but they do fit the bill here. This may sound like blasphemy, and hopefully I'll win you over by the end of the review, but Hedron Crab for that reason really doesn't work here for me. I'll see if I can dig up better options that both mill us and reliably have evasion to give us the Connive triggers. Moving on to removal in the deck, I am a little bit torn. I absolutely love the thematic removal that you have here, but that said, I worry that a bunch of this is conditional, meaning that you may not get to use it when you need it, either because it's sorcery speed or you don't have the right setup, or the thing that you need to deal with doesn't match your removal spell. Normally, I would be recommending the fun, whimsical spells, but because this is a mid-range deck, we want to have the ability to control the game as needed, and our spells need to enable that freedom of choice. While they are less unique, spells like Anguished Unmaking, Path, and Swords may serve you far better than some of the removal that you have. Moving on to mill cards, regular base deck department enjoyers know that I'm down bad for any graveyard related strategies, but I have a love-hate relationship with cards like Otherworldly Gaze, Glimpse the Unthinkable, or even Golgari Thug. At face value, they are perfect for the deck. They're cheap, they get a bunch of stuff into the graveyard that we can reanimate, or that support the Goyfs. It sounds great in practice, but I have found that they often suck. To get a handful of cards into the graveyard, we're sacrificing a card every time. That may not seem significant, but you could use 3 of these effects and be down like 3 cards, yet see very little tangible impact on the game. First I came for Hedron Crab, and now I'm coming for Stinkweed Imp, another card that I love, but I think it also falls prey to this. Its dredge ability sees it return to our hand and get 5 cards in the graveyard, which is a lot. But what then? I personally really don't want to be casting it, because a 1-power threat in a deck that wants to apply pressure is way too slow. This would be completely different in my Marin deck, where I'm all too happy to use it as a blocker to deter incoming attacks, but that is a much slower, more grindy deck. I say all this because I think these cards could be one of the leading contributors to your card advantage issues. And this issue is completely unlike cards that you have in Ripples of Undeath or Ledger Shredder, where the primary effect on the card is really strong and the mill is just an upside. Ledger Shredder is an evading, growing threat that synergizes with Raffine really well, and Ripples gets you more cards in hand as well as filling your graveyard. So expect me to recommend a whole bunch of mill options where we get the mill along with another ability or effect that is meaningful for the deck. Speaking about card advantage, you are correct, the deck really doesn't have enough of it. And what we do have is pretty conditional. Visions of the Beyond and Jace the Perfected Mind are really great, but they only really get us advantage after about turn 5 or later because of the 20 card limitation. Everflowing Well and Kiora aren't really card advantage, and Treasure Cruise, while a banger, can be a bit hit or miss depending when you draw it and depending how many irrelevant cards you have to delve in your graveyard. Then Court of Ardenvale is great here as a recursion engine, but it's not going to refill the hand. So in short, I agree that this is a spot where we have to do some work, but you'd already flagged that, so we're on the same page. Moving on to ramp, and I don't think this deck wants any ramp as a focus area. The curve is really low, and we have nothing really meaningful to ramp into. A card like Arcane Signet is probably never going to be a desired turn 2 play, and something like Deranged Assistant makes more sense, but if we don't want ramp, there are far better ways to mill cards. Now, being the greediest frog imaginable, I look at all the spell recursion and chortle about all the devious things that I could do with it. That said, I feel like the best possible targets here are probably a reanimation spell or a board wipe. I understand why they're here with all the mill in the deck, but I would probably rather just go in a looting direction overall and simply never discard our good spells in the first place. That said, my view on that will probably depend on where we land with the mill package. With all of this in mind, I think the things that I would focus the deck on would stay pretty true to what you have right now, with the exception of ramp. And as always, if I had to visualize that on a character sheet, it would look a little bit like what's on screen right now. Here is a visualization of which cards I'd keep, which ones I'd definitely change, and which ones I'm unsure about. I'm not going to go through each card one by one, but Kit, you know where to find me to get clarity, and if you, dear viewer, are curious about why I've made a particular choice or recommendation, head down to the comments. More importantly, here are some cards that I would consider bringing into the deck in line with the changes and recommendations I've made. I'm not saying all of these should be added, but these are the cards that I think are worth considering as you weigh up my thoughts. Starting with removal, I've already mentioned some of the classic removal options at our disposal, like Swords, Path, and Anguished Unmaking. I'll add to that Dire Tactics, which I think is a pretty solid option, as well as Foul the Profane and Sink into Stupor as MDFCs that come into play untapped. Lethal Scheme is an absolute banger in this deck. It has Convoke and allows the creatures that convoked it to connive, which is perfect for our game plan. I think Shriekmaw is also worth considering, as its removal is a creature and it goes straight to the graveyard if we evoke it. I also really like Price of Fame, given it does double duty of removing something and milling, which is both things that we want. Given we're a mid-range deck and we care about tempo and pressure, I think Comeback Wrong can also be an interesting option because we get to use our opponent's stuff against them. Terratide is decent as a wipe, and I think that Living Death is at least worth consideration as it both reanimates our stuff and clears the board. If we cast it mid-game, we should benefit far more than our opponents. Seasons of Loss is also really interesting. It can be a solid removal option, or it can draw us a bunch of cards, or we can use it as a finisher. I'm a huge fan of cards that do multiple things that we want in a deck, and we seem to want all of these things. There are also other interesting synergistic removal options, like Spontaneous Mutation, Fear of Death, and Song of Stupefaction. There's also something like Quag Feast. These go against my point about limitations a little bit, but they're probably still worth considering. Especially if you find yourself using the majority of your removal to control your opponent's board so that they can't block. We've also got cards like Unauthorized Exit, Winds of Rebuke, and Ifara's Dispersal. What I really like about cards like this is the versatility. They can deal with problematic blockers or perhaps problematic permanents, they can deal with problematic attackers coming at you, and can even bounce your own stuff to protect them. Let's talk about reanimation and recursion. Unlike some of the current recursion options, it's not a creature, but I really like mission briefing in decks like this, as it both gets cards into the graveyard and gives us the option to recur a spell. Given how cheap our creatures are, a spell like Corpse Churn could be really good here as it both mills and recurs. Dewdrop Cure is unbelievably cute, but also very strong depending how many impactful 2-mana cards we end up having. Patch Up is a similar and reasonably good option, hitting both some small stuff or a single 3-drop. Can't Stay Away is also good, is cute, and is a reasonable option given it comes with flashback. One of the better options, Pre-War Formal Wear, is really great in this deck. It reanimates a creature for us and makes it stronger as an attacking and defensive force. I think Chthonian Nightmare could be an incredibly strong card here, continually resurrecting our bigger, scarier creatures for the cost of a mobilized token or a less impactful smaller creature. Given the deck seems to care much more about value rather than explosive power and a continuous barrage of threats, one of my all-time favorite cards is Oversouled Cemetery, and I think it could be really good here. Last but not least, Afterlife from the Loam seems like it could be a good mid to late game play in this deck. Let's talk about our creatures. Right out of the gate, I want to focus on tokens, and in that vein, I think Voice of Victory is incredible here. It has Mobilize, giving us more attackers for our Raffine triggers, and stops our opponents interfering with our attacks. While nowhere near as strong, we may want to consider Dolkoven Pack Beasts purely because of its Mobilize trigger for the Raffine triggers. Inox Strike Leader is very good here, creating 3 tokens and thus 3 connive triggers when we attack with Raffine. Equally good is Adeline Resplendent Cathar. And while we're talking about tokens, Cosmogrand Zenith could also help with that, as can Chasm Skulker, Hallowed Spirit Keeper, or Tangled Colony. Avon Heartstabber is similar yet different. It gets bigger as our graveyard fills up, and when it dies, it both mills cards and draws us a card. Dogged Detective could be solid here. It's a creature, it mills, and it keeps coming back. Given our Goyf strategy, I think Night Howler could be a really solid inclusion. And while it's more expensive and doesn't really fit into our reanimation theme, Sewer Nemesis is really powerful. It's probably worth mentioning Master of Death as a solid surveil engine, but I feel like his mana cost hurts and makes him too slow here, but I'm bringing him up regardless. What's arguably a better version is Unshakable Tail. It has a reasonable body, it surveils, and can draw us cards, not to mention recurring itself. I think including Wonder in a deck like this is almost a must. It has the power to win games single-handedly, and we don't even have to pay for its ability. I think we have most of the good scarier 3-drops, but Scab Ruinator seems pretty good. Rotting Regisaur isn't quite as good, but is probably still worth considering. And Nethergoyf seems incredibly solid here as a 1-drop. As far as cheap creatures go, Undead Butler, while not having evasion, mills cards and recurs a creature. Snooping Newsy both mills cards and synergizes with our graveyard theme. Desmond Miles has evasion and surveils a whole lot when he deals damage given our connive triggers. Keeper of the Dead is a really interesting card here as a source of removal. I think proccing it will be super easy, so we basically have a removal effect every turn cycle. In the same vein, it's probably worth considering Royal Assassin. Last but not least, Commiz is a strong addition here. It helps with connive, makes our creatures harder to block, or just deal much more damage. Yes, he's 4 mana, but that effect is pretty powerful. Let's talk about our mill cards. Now, by this point, I've already pointed out a bunch of mill across the other cards and categories, in line with my point about how I don't like incremental mill for mill's sake. That said, I will call out a few cards that I think are worth considering, starting with cards like Traumatize or Singularity Rupture. These cards, when paired with the Goyfs, can do some serious work, and personally, rather than paying 1 for a Hedron Crab and milling like 12 or 15 cards, I'd rather pay 5 for a Traumatize and potentially end up in a game-winning spot. I'm going to mention a bit of a random spell in Drag the Canal. In the right circumstances, it gives you a creature to help with connive procs, and then mills 2 cards and gives us a clue to help with card advantage. Quite a different spell is Grave Strength. It mills 3 cards, but then we get to put some or a whole lot of 1/1 counters on a creature, and that seems like something we would want here. Invasion of Amonkhet is also interesting. It mills 3 cards, it draws us a card, and makes our opponent's discard, and then when flipped is a copy of anything, but it's a 4/4. Seems pretty good in a mid-range deck that wants to grind down resources. Case of the Shifting Visage is a bit slow, but could be one of those cards that offers the deck some serious explosive power. It surveils, but more importantly, most of our creatures are non-legendary, and copying things like the Oculus or Avenger sound like a really good time. And we're back on base deck departments, cards that do multiple things that we want Hype Train. Obscura Confluence at 4 mana isn't cheap, but we get to do a bunch of things that we want. The first mode can deal with tricky blockers, and the second mode connives, milling cards and making our creatures stronger, and the last mode can return up to 3 creatures from our graveyard to our hand. Based. Card advantage in a deck like this is a little bit tricky. We want to be spending our mana on threats to keep up tempo, not necessarily spending that mana to draw cards. But at the same time, we need to have reliable card draw so we don't run out of steam. The best possible avenues are cards like Unshakable Tail, but here are a few good options that I would consider to bolster those methods. One of my all-time favorites is Deep Analysis. There are also cards like Notion Rain, Pilfered Plans, Atrocious Experiment, and Diasight that can both surveil and create card advantage. What I probably like far more here, especially if we have a bunch of tokens kicking around, is spells like Village Rites. And I really like the instant speed versions of these spells the most because it allows us to respond to removal and sacrifice tokens before they get dealt damage if they're blocked. Lastly, given my recommendations around the mobilized creatures, I think Skull Clamp would be a real no-brainer here. I'm not going to go too deep into the mana base here, but I would streamline things a little bit so that there's a very low risk of our lands coming into play tapped. More importantly, I think this deck would really like Spymaster's Vault. So, Kit, I'll leave you to make your own decisions, but I think some of these cards would really help the deck. I believe making better use of Raffine's connive triggers is the best way to reliably fill the graveyard, and doing that well will transform how the deck plays in a really good way. Bringing in some more low-cost creatures I recommend, and especially those that create tokens to get more connive triggers, are the key here. I also advocate removing mill for mill's sake, and only including a mill card if it does something else for you too. Doing that, removing the ramp, and using the sacrificial card draw spells are probably the biggest structural changes I would recommend. Everything else is just interesting card swaps in your existing categories. All of this will result in a deck that I think will still play how you want it to play, but will be less clunky and solve that feast or famine problem that you've been having with card advantage. So Kit, I hope this gives you the tools you need to make your Raffine deck more conniving, and that this help will be what you hoped it would. Okay, that was a banger. And if you're enjoying this, I cook up videos like this that help you think differently about Commander. Videos that help you build better decks, play better, and have more fun. If you want more of that, like the video to tell the algorithm that you think it's good, and subscribe to help me in my quest to reach 100,000 subscribers, but much more importantly, to make sure that my next banger gets delivered directly into your eyeballs. If you want to submit your own decks for future episodes, hop into the brewing channel in my Discord and follow the instructions, or become one of my patrons on Patreon to jump the rapidly growing queue and to get access to a whole bunch of other cool stuff too. If you want more prioritized or personal help, you can find that too via my commissions on Ko-fi, all of which you can find the links to down below the like button. Next up, let's look at Shiko, Paragon of the Way, sent in as a commission on Ko-fi by Ian. Shiko is a 5-mana Jeskai Spirit Dragon and is a 4/5 with Flying and Vigilance. When Shiko enters, we exile target non-land card with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard, and we get to cast a copy of it for free. And important to note that Shiko can target any non-land card so that we can recur all manner of interesting cards. Now, I really love dragons and I love free stuff, so I had my eye on Shiko since the moment that Tarkia Dragonstorm was spoiled. Needless to say, this is a deck I was very excited to help with, so thank you, Ian. And this was their brief to me. What I love about the deck is that it can generate a crazy amount of value with Shiko being able to cast all those spells from the graveyard for free. The biggest problem I've run into is just being completely smashed by green decks that crush me with tons of huge trampling creatures, and I run out of removal spells to keep them in check. What often happens is that I may have a strong turn where I blink Shiko a bunch and cast a bunch of free spells, and the whole table looks over and says, hey, that guy's doing an awful lot of stuff over there, we probably need to kill him. And my little creatures and life total have no chance of holding up when the other 3 players swing out at me. I would like the deck to be able to be played in bracket 4, since that's usually the level that I play at. And I get to put in all my cool game changes like Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat, Smothering Tithe, and the extra mean Grand Arbiter Augustin, since I enjoy playing it so much. For the archetype of the deck, I'm a little bit lost on what I want it to be. I tried the combo route, but it got very boring with the same kind of win over and over. Mid-range Blink, non-creature spell prowess synergy, and control all seem to be solid routes that I could take. I would say that the most important cards in the deck to me are Displacer Kitten, Soul Herder, That's a Deep Dwelling, and Ishtola Rule, because they allow me to consistently blink Shiko and get value out of the graveyard. If I could win around turn 6 to 7 every game, that would be ideal, and I'd like to be able to play a full game and get plenty of actions out of the deck. Okay, let's dive into the deck list, and again, thoughts as I saw them. So right off the bat, I think this deck finds itself in a bit of a tricky spot. To me, a deck that wants to take so many game actions and doesn't want to combo is in an awkward spot in bracket 4, both because of the pace of the game, but also because of the strength and consistency of the threats that are presented to us. I personally feel that the strategy would be far more at home and fun, definitely in bracket 3 and perhaps in bracket 2. That said, given Ian wants to run game changers, I would lean towards bracket 3. Playing at a lower power also opens up the possibilities of win conditions, because a deck like this, especially in bracket 4, typically needs a win condition that can be executed in one turn. This is again both because of the pace of the game, but also the highlighted problem in the brief, where the moment that your deck and engine comes online, people go, well, this needs to stop. It's at that point that we need to be able to switch on our deck's afterburners and go for the win. But if our win condition is too telegraphed or incremental, it makes our life really hard at a high power level. Whether that's a field of hasty prowess creatures or a combo, in this type of shell, where we're basically generating a bunch of value from small spells, that is going to be a combo style win 99% of the time because it's necessitated by the bracket. Similar to my feedback in the previous point, I feel bracket 4 is forcing our hand to need to play a combo whether we like it or not, and that any other style of win condition will closely need to resemble a combo in order to prove good and strong enough. An army of prowess creatures is still just a combo with extra steps. All that said, I'll try to offer help to keep this within bracket 4 and be competitive nonetheless. So as I look at Shiko, I imagine the win condition we're going to want to find is something that plays into our strengths, which is non-land cards that cost 3 or less. We'll see where we end up as I make the recommendations. And I feel like the rough game plan is going to be using our 3 mana spells to interact and keep ourselves alive until we can combo out. I look at cards like Rel, Crackling Wit, War Eater's Call, and Saheeli, and the only way I see them being good enough for bracket 4 is if we're creating some near infinite loop. The incremental value created by the card simply isn't good enough at this power level otherwise. Rel's ultimate is obviously incredibly strong, but we're going to need to cast 6 to 7 spells to get him there, and I could see us using Shiko and Displacer Kitten to get there, but then I feel like Shiko and Displacer plus something else equals a win anyway. Corey Steelcutter, while broken, has a similar problem. Yes, we make a prize creature every second cast, but I imagine how this plays out is that over 2 to 3 turns, we make around 3 to 6 prize creatures, and that doesn't necessarily have a meaningful game impact in bracket 4. Coruscation Mage faces a similar problem, but it's great if we end up trying to win via ping triggers, though I doubt we will. I don't really love Teferi Time Reveler here. Yes, it makes players less likely to interact with us on our turn, but I don't feel like that's a hard requirement for the deck. I know he has a strong interaction with Displacer Kitten, but that's only with 0 mana spells, which we don't really have, and I'm probably not going to advocate for something like Lion's Eye Diamond or other $600 cards in bracket 4. His ability is also Sorcery Speed, meaning that if we Shiko him in on another's turn, we can't activate him till ours, which is another mark against him. Charming Scoundrel's effect seems quite weak here. Yes, she can ramp, but would we ever be excited to draw this card? I'm not so sure. And I'm going to call out that I think Grand Arbiter actually does very little for our game plan here. That said, Ian, I know you like it, and its effect is generically always good, so I won't recommend that we take it out, but it costs 4 mana and it's not playing into our main strategy anyway, so it feels like an indulgence, which is always a bit risky in bracket 4. Now, I really love Lise, which is evidenced by the fact that I built a deck around her, but I fear the cost reduction isn't optimal when our goal is to play things that are 3 mana value or less via Shiko. If the cost reduction affected that in some way, great, but it doesn't, and as a combat threat, she just doesn't do enough to justify her place. I don't see enough game-winning enchantments to make running moon-based cleric worth the spot, even if we can flicker them. And speaking of flicker, I think Philia is very weak here, likely being at best a single flicker trigger and not at instant speed. Because I feel like this deck wants to play a bunch of instant speed flicker spells to enable us to Shiko and thus interact at instant speed. Quantum Riddler to me seems only good if we're regularly dipping down to having very few cards in hand, and I'm not sure how often that happens. Speaking of drawing cards, I love Teferi's Ageless Insight, like in my Simon deck where it puts in absolutely game-breaking work. But how strong is it for us here? It's probably just a little bit too expensive before it does something impactful, and I feel the same way about Farewell. Yes, it's strong, but it's also very, very slow. Blasphemous Act is a maybe, because while good, I really want sub 3 mana value answers. Split Up is an absolute banger for that reason. I feel Flare of Denial is probably subpar here because we may not have that many blue creatures we're willing to sacrifice. And similar to my point in the previous review, I'm not sure of the value of Otherworldly Gaze. Yes, it gets stuff into the yard, but is that really that necessary? Whenever I play these kinds of cards, I feel like I'd rather have something else in hand most of the time. I love Swan Song, but Strict Serenade seems more subjectively good, and we may just rather want a straight up counter effect, especially if we're casting it off a Shiko trigger. Given how important Shiko, a 5 mana commander, is to the game plan, I think the deck needs more mana sources. Which is usually something most people don't love to hear. Ideally 38 lands and 12 sources of ramp, or a total of 50 mana sources. We could be very greedy and do 36 lands, but the ramp number still needs to increase. A card like Smothering Tithe doesn't count here, because we want to ramp into an earlier Shiko and a 4 mana cost spell doesn't do that. I absolutely love Parting Gust, but given how I'm thinking of the deck playing at instant speed, any instant speed flicker spells we run need to return Shiko to play immediately so that we can use that for counter spells and interaction. Ones that return Shiko at the end of the turn are very subpar in this specific case. Next up, I'm going to flag cards like Esper Sentinel and Mystic Remora. While they're typically good at high power, I find they are highly dependent on one's personal meta. And I think it's worth looking at that and evaluating how many cards on average we draw from these to justify their spot. Quite often, a slightly worse spell that fits into our theme is far better than an objectively better all-round spell that is generically good but doesn't fit our game plan. Rather than these, I would probably rather personally have looting effects and or more flicker spells in this specific deck. I'm worried Ishtala is far too slow and win more at 6 mana. I'm going to leave them in because they're a favourite, but I would seriously challenge them. I have an overall point to make about tutor creatures like Imperial Recruiter. They're only as good as the stuff we're tutoring for, and in my mind that's got to be win cons here. Yes, I know they can do other stuff, but to me their place in the deck lives or dies based on how potent the card is that they're going to fetch. And that's especially true in this deck where it looks like value generation and flexibility isn't going to be an issue. After looking through the deck list and gathering my thoughts, here's some food for thought and cards to consider. And firstly, we're going to need to figure out our win conditions. I think Stellarly and Twisted Fealty for an instant win, or Stellar plus Refocus to draw a whole deck, could be really good and probably my preferred win line here. And that's because both cards are 3 mana, so they can be Shiko'd, or our Imperial Recruiter can fetch Stellar. Spellseeker can also fetch Refocus if we include it. It's very easy for us to Shiko Stellar out on an end step, and then on our turn, a simple flicker spell on Shiko will give us the 2 required spells to create the win con by casting and copying Twisted Fealty. I know this is a combo, and that Ian wasn't keen on combos, but this is about as synergistic as it gets in this deck, and it avoids the more common and far less interesting combo lines. I was initially unsure about Monastery Mentor, but in hindsight I think it's strong enough that it can be a standalone backup win condition in this deck all by itself. I definitely don't think that heavily trying to index into prowess creatures and synergies is the right way to go. Now, Ian mentioned they were struggling with green creature decks, and may I introduce you to the perfect 3 mana instant and fantastic tutor target in Hibernation. It's a global effect, it doesn't target, and it doesn't destroy, so phasing is pretty much all that can protect the board. Filter Out is also worth considering for non-creature permanents if that's a concern, but it hits our own stuff too. If we were to include a card like Hibernation, or just the Stellarity win line, I'm not saying that we need them, but Solve the Equation, Personal Tutor, and Merchant Scroll could all be considered for this deck to find the stuff that we want. Stroke of Midnight is probably better in this deck than Generous Gift because of the 1/1 rather than the 3/3 for the opponent, however we could run both. I'm confident that running instant speed flicker spells is going to be the way we want to go, and I have listed a whole bunch on screen. Some are better than others, but all are worth considering. Grasp of Fate is a really solid removal option if we're Shikoing it in at instant speed. And Teleportation Circle, Conjurer's Closet, and Far Traveler are known good repetitive sources of flicker if we want more of those in the deck. Crawl Space could also be a good option to help deal with wide boards. And Brass's Tunnel Grinder and Seize the Spoil could be decent cards in the deck to help us get stuff into the graveyard. Gamble is also pretty good here given the graveyard and recursion theme. And while Jessica's Will doesn't put stuff in the graveyard, I think it's probably also quite good here. For counterspells, I think Dovin's Veto, Permission Denied, and Render Silence should all be considered. I feel like a flicker deck at this power level probably wants to consider the One Ring. It's a solid effect and we can flicker it to remove the counters. Saloon Division is also great as an MDFC here, and yes, it's a tapped land, but I think it's worth the downside. And Sundering Eruption is also great if we end up playing prowess tokens as a win con. I think Mists of Lorien is a fantastic removal option here, especially because we can Shiko it at instant speed, and I think this is a whole category of cards that we should be considering, which is ones with low mana value but that can be upgraded. This includes cards with Kicker, Replicate, etc. Dam would be a great example if we had black, but in this deck, spells like Mists of Lorien and Galadriel's Dismissal are both good examples. Looking at ramp, I think at this power level we really want to be considering cards like Chrome Mox or Mox Amber. I think that at a lower power level, but at a higher synergy, is also cards like Millikan and Deranged Assistant as turn 2 ramp plays. Orum's Chant is one of my favorite cards from when I first started playing Magic, and I think it's a fantastic way to stop a player comboing out, or to be used as a defensive option to fog a player. 3 Steps Ahead seems really good here, as a counterspell, a copy spell, or just as a way to draw and discard cards. When it comes to draw and discard, I also really like Thirst for Discovery and something like Pieces of the Puzzle, much more than a card like Brain Surge because it lacks the discard portion. I think Storm as an ability is interesting to explore here, and Amphibian Downpour seems like it could be a real banger. I'm probably not going to recommend a token-based strategy en masse, but if we did go that route, Haze of Rage seems like it could also be pretty good. And with all that said, here are my thoughts on recommendations of what we should definitely do with this deck. Starting with win conditions again, and I'm going to labor the point because I think it's useful. I think there is an inherent issue that this deck faces in that its original game plan is incremental value generation. Those are good in bracket 2 or 3, but they just suck in bracket 4. Because they're not explosive enough. By incremental, I mean things like ping damage or go wire strategies that build up across a few turns. There is a reason that most decks employ some sort of combo win in bracket 4 because it's really hard to get a consistent turn 6 to 7 win condition unless you resort to combos, or at least effects that are multiplicative in their effects or that are spread, having the same effect on each player. It's also worth mentioning that the moment that said win condition, regardless of how strong it is, requires more than at most 3 cards, it makes it almost untenable. To buck that trend, something that pings and also works, like Nekusar, only works because most players employ strategies like continuous wheels on the same turn, driving down everyone's health at the same time. In this current deck and game plan, the cards like War Eater's Call or Coruscation Mage in my opinion are very bad, because we would need upwards of 20 plus spells to really threaten for a win. And in the case of War Eater's Call, we'd also need another token generator to enable that to begin with. If this were my deck, I would be focusing on getting my enjoyment from playing the deck and interacting with the game first and foremost, rather than the winning bit. Filling my graveyard and then having the ability to use instant speed flicker to access my interaction toolbox in my graveyard when necessary, or to gain value as I dig through for my win conditions. And I think maybe the issue that exists here, because the flicker is more tied to our turn, and is for a lack of a better word more solitary, is that we have little to do other than trying to create a fun win condition, as opposed to instead finding the fun from being nimble and using Shiko's trigger as an instant speed control enabler. In that way, the latter here makes each ephemerate style spell into a draw spell, a counter spell, a piece of removal, or a tutor, or whatever we need it to be. That is vastly oversimplifying it, but at least to me, the idea of that playstyle seems far more fun. And the fact that those instant speed flicker spells double up as protection sources for Shiko or our other win condition in Stellar Lee is even better. And I say all of that primarily because I think the game plan here is really interesting and fun, and I'd like to help preserve that. But I don't see a world where we can pivot from our value engine Shikoing to a non-combo win condition with any real success. This is also partially because I think a problem this deck is going to run into, or already runs into, is that we want to do a lot of things. Probably too many things. It wants good spells to flicker, and it wants ways to flicker those spells. It also needs ramp, and it also needs ways to get our spells into the graveyard, and that's before we even talk about winning the game. It's partially for that reason that I advocate for a win condition like the Stellar Lee one, where it needs very few cards or additional support to function. Monastery Mentor can be a separate standalone win con all by itself without additional token pieces purely because of the strength of the prowess. And if I think about streamlining this into a core game plan, these are the 5 things that I'd want this deck to have. Visualized on a character sheet, they look a little bit like this. Leaning into Stellar and Mentor gives us some whimsy in the win con department, partially because I don't see anyone else doing it in Shiko. I think that for Mentor, the real power here is copying it once or twice to create explosiveness. I've put on screen a bunch of copy mechanics that we could use that all sit at or below 3 mana value. My favorites are arguably 3 Steps Ahead, again a card that can do multiple things that we want, or Glasspool Mimic as an MDFC. All of these can obviously also copy Displacer Kitten for absolute shenanigans. With all this said and done, here are the final recommendations that I made to Ian, and I'll put the list on screen. As this was a commission, I provided a list with suggested changes, but I always encourage that the person I'm reviewing for, or you, make your own choices about the cards that you enjoy. I'm going to be right a lot of the time, but I'm also going to be objectively or subjectively wrong quite a lot. I've tried to go for a list that I would find enjoyable to play, that keeps as closely tied to the original list as possible whilst also solving some of the problems. The deck skews towards a much more controlling game plan and style now, with either Stellarly and Twisted Fealty as a win con, or a horde of prowess creatures via Monastery Mentor and copies. The copy options I've included are 3 Steps Ahead, Quasi-Duplicate, and Glasspool Mimic. Only Quasi-Duplicate is a dedicated copy spell, which means that this line won't really affect the rest of the deck and probably won't make it clunky. To help with this control style, I've included 8 instant speed blink spells. They all focus on importantly bringing Shiko back right away so that we're able to use them for interaction. I've also added in a few options to help keep us safe from those disgusting hordes of green creatures. Spells like Orum's Chant, Galadriel's Dismissal, Amphibian Downpour, and Mists of Lorien can all deal with wider boards. These are obviously not permanent solutions, but I imagine that our problem is key big swing attacks less so than constant pressure over 3 to 4 turns. All of these synergize well with the deck being at 3 mana or lower. If I had any lingering concerns, it would be that there's not enough of an engine to get cards into the graveyard, but I feel that there aren't many fantastic options to do that. That said, cards like Brass's Tunnel Grinder, Telerian Winds, Seize the Spoils, and of course the OG Wheel of Fortune all exist if we want to add them. I feel all these changes will give a very reliable and competitive deck with a bunch of spells that are going to make the deck highly reactive in the game and give us plenty of space to interact or express skill. So, Ian, I hope this gave you the tools to make your Shiko deck far more interesting and fun, whilst also keeping that sharp power edge, allowing you to be competitive in Bracket 4. And I hope that you, dear base viewer, have found this useful. And if you have thoughts on either of these builds, or you think there's a banger card that I missed, or you have input, yeet yourself at the comments right meow. Last but definitely not least, if you want more deck building magic, go watch one of these 2 videos, and as always, thank you for being here.